Our first speakers are John Brown and John Hughes. They're going to be talking to us about implementing an electronic contract program. John Hughes is an agribusiness account manager at John Deere Financial. He's enjoyed working in a variety of credit, sales, and marketing roles during his John Deere career. His undergraduate business degree is from the University of Northern Iowa, where he was a summa cum laude graduate in human resource management with a minor in business communication. John earned his law degree from the University of Iowa and is a licensed attorney in Iowa. John Brown is the Associate Chief Counsel for John Deere Financial. He is a graduate of Northwestern University with a BA in Economics and Political Science and the University of Iowa School of Law. He earned his JD in 1980. He provides the legal support for U.S. consumer and commercial installment lending in all 50 states, along with legal support on privacy and information security issues, and John Deere's U.S. bank, John Deere Financial, FSB. He is licensed to practice law in Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. He was selected as the John Deere Fellow in Financial Services Law in 2015. He is on the governing board of the Conference on Consumer Credit Law and the State Historical Society of Iowa, and is chairman of the Payment Card Subcommittee of the American Financial Services Association Law Committee. He's published articles in the Drake Journal of Agricultural Law, the Consumer Finance Law Quarterly Report, the Journal of Bankruptcy Law and Practice, and with John Hughes, the Kentucky Journal of Equine, Natural Resources, and Agricultural Law. I've been looking forward to this talk for almost a year when these guys volunteered to give it, so without further ado, John.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. My name is John Hughes with John Deere Financial. Pleased to be joined by my teammate John Brown from John Deere Financial. And today we wanted to talk about the John Deere Financial experience working with electronic signature contracts. Some of the business and legal considerations that we made along the way, some best practices, some lessons learned, and hopefully some neat ideas that you might find helpful as you go back to your clients working with electronic signature. So as Dennis mentioned, John and I are both attorneys, and yet we work in different parts of the John Deere Financial enterprise. John works in our law department, does a great job there, and my career has primarily been on the business marketing sales side. And John and I have been working together off and on around electronic signature, working with our John Deere dealers, and then most recently working on some legal research, particularly around remote electronic signature. And look forward to sharing that information with you here today. So first, a bit of background around John Deere Financial, the company that employs John and me. For those of you in the Des Moines area, you might have seen our headquarters building on 86th Street in Johnston. There, we book 120,000 contracts each and every year on equipment financing. And they're coming in from John Deere dealers across the United States, equating to about $8 billion each year. And what's notable, the John Deere dealers that send in the business to John Deere Financial for their equipment purchases for customers, those dealers are independent businesses. So they're not obligated to use John Deere Financial. We're certainly appreciative of the business that they send to us, but because they're independent, they have a choice. And so when they voice their concerns about particular things with John Deere Financial, or they might highlight some emerging things such as electronic signature, we're really excited to hear that so that we can help serve their needs even more. So as we talk today, you'll hear that John Deere dealer theme and how we were able to be responsive to that need within the dealer marketplace. Another thing to note here about today's presentation, while John Deere Financial is a global company, our presentation today will focus primarily on U.S. law. We have some limited experience in Australia and Brazil around electronic signature, but the bulk of our experience is around the U.S. law, U.S. experience. So we have a path today for our presentation, and really it mirrors the path that we took at John Deere Financial to implement electronic signature. First, we're going to set the scene. What were the considerations? What were some of the factors that came into play around electronic signature? And then John is going to share the legal landscape. What were the laws? What were some of the considerations there as we looked at electronic signature? Then we mentioned that John Deere dealer need. Sure enough, that shows up here, as well as at a high level, the technology. What were some of the things that we looked at, the vendors, some of the considerations there. And then putting all those pieces together to form the solution that we offered up to John Deere dealers. And then some future things. What are some next steps around electronic signature at John Deere Financial? We're going to focus on offline signing and then remote signing such that no one is able to witness that person signing the contract for equipment financing. And then finally, some best practices that we'd be happy to share with you as well. As you think of questions or think of comments, if you will, please go ahead and hold those to the end. John and I will be happy to take those at the end of today's presentation. So let's set the scene. And up here, you'll see that there are 3 images, and really what we try to do at John Deere Financial is provide balance between these 3 areas. The first, on the upper hand left corner, that John Deere dealer image. And for those of you who have crisscrossed the state of Iowa, likely have seen a John Deere dealer. And that John Deere dealer, perhaps 30, 40, 50 years ago, was a small family-run, family-operated business. Today, those John Deere dealers are becoming much more corporate in their approach and are looking for business efficiencies just like any other large business. So when those John Deere dealers came to us and talked to us about electronic signature, that was one of the considerations that we wanted to make sure that we understood. We move over to that picture of the customer. And sure enough, this customer is holding a tablet computer. And our survey evidence, we're finding across the country that farmer producers are becoming much more comfortable around electronic solutions, technology. They're using technology to make planting decisions, technology for their operation across the board. So when these customers are becoming more familiar and in some cases demanding more electronic convenience, that's a consideration that we took in as well. And then finally, we had to consider the law. What was the law telling us around the early 2000s, but what does the law continue to tell us around things such as remote signature? All of these things, we wanted to make sure that we maintained a balance, and as we looked to vendors who could meet our needs for electronic signature, that was first and foremost, understand the dealer, the customer, and what the law would provide. And for that law presentation, I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton over to my friend John.
Yeah, the legal landscape evolved approximately 20 years ago on this. And first, prior to '97, some of the states had passed electronic transaction laws. A lot of them were not technically neutral. They required a certain technology that, the fear was it would soon be out of date. They were not uniform at all. And so the National Conference on Uniform State Laws formed a committee in '97 to create a Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. In 1999, that committee completed their work. That was proposed to the states, and very rapidly, 37 states adopted it. Unfortunately, a lot of those states, I think 19 of them, including Iowa, made significant changes to it. And uniform law really only works if you basically adopt the uniform law. So it wasn't like most of the provisions of the Uniform Commercial Code and other uniform laws. It was very much different state by state. And so those of us that wanted to promote electronic commerce realized that UEDA had so far failed because it had not been adopted in a uniform way. And so an effort rose up to create a federal statute that would, in some circumstances, preempt UEDA. And Deere participated with a number of other companies in a group called the National Coalition for Privacy and Electronic Commerce. And the e-Sign Act was proposed, the Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act. And it's very much like UEDA. It doesn't require a certain technology. And it's an overlay statute. So if you have some statute that's already enacted that says you have to do something in paper, the federal e-sign law and UETA say, notwithstanding those provisions, you can do it electronically. And so that passed. There are more provisions in e-sign that relate to consumer transactions, but it's very similar to UETA. And as we discussed later, it had kind of a reverse preemption approach to it, so that if necessary, it could preempt state law. And then most of the states realized that they had to conform to UETA or be preempted by the federal statute. And so we're now at a point where most states have adopted UETA. And also in 2000, there were significant changes to Article 9, the secured transaction provision of the Uniform Commercial Code. And one of the things they added was the electronic chattel paper concept. And this is in Section 9105 of the UCC. And with regular chattel paper like promissory notes, you have to possess by getting possession of the note or having an agent of yours have possession. Well, how do you take possession of an electronic contract? And they developed this concept of authoritative copy. And if you had control of that, or if your agent had control of it, you then had a perfected interest in that electronic chattel paper. Well, then after 2000, the states realized we either have to have our state law on electronic transactions be preempted by the federal statute, or we have to adopt UETA without significant variations, because the federal e-sign law says it preempts any inconsistent state law unless it's a Uniform Electronic Transactions Act substantially as proposed by NACUSL without any significant variations. And so in 2004, Iowa adopted UETA with just very, very minor changes that didn't really affect the preemption computation. And so UETA is now the law in Iowa. And so today, we now have 45 states that have adopted the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act without significant variations. And some of these outlier states, like California, has adopted UETA, but they've made some changes that say it doesn't apply to certain consumer installment financing. And some of these other states, like Illinois, have just a radically different law. And so they're preempted today by the federal statute. As I mentioned here, the National Conference on Commissioners on Uniform State Laws first adopted UETA, and then when e-sign came into effect, they had this reverse preemption. And this preempts any state e-commerce law that's either not an adoption of NACUSL UETA, it can't have anything that's inconsistent with the federal e-sign law, and it can't have excessive exceptions. So all these e-sign laws have some exceptions, like for wills and codicils and I think power of attorney. But if you start exempting a lot of other types of transactions, then e-sign will preempt the state law. And then, as I mentioned, we had the Article 9.1 or Section 9105 of the UCC was adopted in 2000, or was proposed in 2000. Most of the states adopted it in 2001 or 2002. And so that's also now the law. And so all of these developments really created the legal groundwork for what we wanted to do, which was to start having electronic contracts used by our dealers and customers. And unfortunately, as John will explain further, this is one of those rare instances for us where the law was ahead of the business. Usually the business is saying, why can't we do this? And we're saying that the law doesn't allow that yet. In this case, by the end of 2000, we had what we needed to go ahead with electronic transactions. But frankly, every year when we'd propose it, we'd ask, this is a good idea, here's the kind of efficiencies it could drive for us and the dealers and the customers. And the answer usually was, yeah, it's a good idea, but we don't have it in this year's budget. So we had to wait a while. And what we did, though, when we first finally got the approval to go ahead, we created a detailed list of requirements. So we went through all the federal e-sign requirements, all the UETA requirements, which largely parallel e-sign except for e-sign's separate consumer provisions, and all the requirements of the UCC electronic chattel paper concept. And we decided that we would include all the requirements for both commercial and consumer transactions. So while the majority of our business is commercial, tractors, excavators, things like that, we do finance lawnmowers, and we have a commercial use credit card. So we included both the commercial and the consumer ones. And I think that was extremely important, because if your technical people start heading down a road that's different than what the law requires, it's sometimes pretty hard to get them turned around. There are a lot of requirements that did not change. You still have to have the same content. You've still got to look at all the timing. When does a customer get the document? The transaction processes that are required, the different documents that are required, those are all the same. And the disclosures are the same. So on your electronic contract, like for instance on a consumer installment finance contract, the annual percentage rate has to be larger than anything else in the contract. That still has to be on your electronic version of that, and how it appears to the customer, it still has to be larger. So you still have to pay attention to all those other requirements. And then you have to look at the scope of things. So there's a few things that you just can't do electronically, like wills and codicils.
So as John mentioned, really the law was the head of the business in this case around electronic commerce. And to John's credit, he provided a consistent drumbeat within John Deere Financial, encouraging our senior leaders to look at electronic signature solutions. Early 2000s didn't get a whole lot of activity around that, but fast forward a bit to 2008. And we had a John Deere dealer meeting with one of our largest, most influential John Deere dealers in attendance. And it just so happened that that dealer was telling our John Deere Financial leadership, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had electronic signature contracts? We're seeing a need in our business, and we'd really like to see John Deere Financial step up and provide this for dealers across the country. So to the credit of our John Deere Financial leader in attendance, he said, yes, we'll take note of that. Came back to John Brown and said, John, we're hearing about this electronic signature drumbeat across the country, particularly from one of our largest dealers. We're in 2008. Let's see if we can't make this happen in early 2009. So all of a sudden, let's scramble. Let's hurry up and get something into motion. To John's credit, to the credit of a lot of our folks at John Deere Financial, we were able to step up and put something into the marketplace that met the needs of not only this dealer, but dealers across the country. And as we looked at the request of this particular dealer, started to talk to other dealers across the country, we were finding similar themes, and we talked about it earlier. These John Deere dealers are becoming much more corporate in their approach. They're looking for efficiencies where they might have had 2 or 3 locations to manage. Now they have 10, 12, 15 locations to manage. And they're looking to coordinate with customers who are maybe 4 hours away from that John Deere dealer. So all the things that can help move business, get tractors sold, get excavators sold, so much the better. So that's what was really driving that need from the dealer perspective. We also benefited from corporate support, not only within John Deere Financial, but also within Deere and Company from Moline. And that would be one of the best practices that we would like to share, and it's something that I'm sure all of you are familiar as you're putting change effort into motion. That executive sponsor, that leadership from top down to say this is important and this is the way that we're going to go, it's very helpful. And we were blessed to have that with the John Deere Financial experience with electronic signature. And as John mentioned, there were benefits that went not only to the dealer, but also to John Deere Financial when we put electronic signature into motion. And we have a list of benefits up here on the screen. With a lot of good solutions, they tend to decrease the bad things and increase or enhance the good things. And so when you're talking about printing costs for paper, storing contracts, and the mailing costs that would take for the dealer to get that paper contract over to John Deere Financial for booking, electronic signature tends to decrease those bad things or costs. And then in terms of getting that contract signed and over to John Deere Financial for booking, that timeline decreases or enhances the experience there. So lots of good benefits that went to both dealer and John Deere Financial. 2 benefits that we'd like to call out in particular. One, the idea that we had fewer late filed contracts. John Deere Financial will file a UCC to get a security interest in that particular piece. And the idea that we could get that contract sent over to John Deere Financial in a quicker fashion with electronic signature, that just speeds up the time that we have to get that filing in place. Another benefit, particularly for John Deere Financial and dealer, the idea that the contracts, sometimes on paper, customers might get creative and they might want to cross out provisions, might want to write in some things, or by accident the customer might not sign page 7, or page 7 might be missing in the paper contract that the dealer submits. All of those instances require John Deere Financial to send that paper contract back to the dealer, just adds more delay and frustration. The idea behind the electronic signature solution is that that contract language is locked in, and with the electronic signature, that customer is prompted for each and every time that he or she must sign. So the likelihood that a signature is missed goes down dramatically. So those benefits really have helped the experience with dealer and customer and John Deere Financial. And as you can see, some benefits that really go across the board in terms of efficiency. So now we'll go to the technology, and what we'll talk about at a high level, some of the things that we considered, some of the things that we put in place for electronic signature. One of the key things that we had in place goes back to 2004, and it was a credit delivery system that we call Series that allowed John Deere dealers to send in information on customers, the equipment to be financed, send that over electronically on an interface over to John Deere Financial so that we can perform a credit review. And then once that deal is approved, can then electronically generate a contract from that same platform. So that 2004 introduction of Series really sets the foundation for our electronic signature solution at John Deere Financial. The idea that things can be sent in electronically and then that contract can be generated once approved. So we had our system Series in place. We then needed to look to a vendor who could help us build that electronic signature solution for the electronic contract. And John was a part of the vendor committee that we had at John Deere for the selection. And one of the other best practices that we'd like to share today would be the idea that this vendor committee was quite diverse. It involved a lot of different folks from a lot of different parts of not only John Deere Financial, but Deere and Company. And it helped to ensure that we were able to meet the needs of our business more fully once we had those voices aboard. As John tells me, we looked at a number of different vendors. We were very favorably impressed with the vendors that we looked at. We looked at vendors such as Salinas, EchoSign, DocuSign. We'll share the vendor that we selected here in a bit, but equally impressed with all. But we had a set of very specific considerations that we wanted to achieve with this vendor. And we have two up here on the screen with John Deere Financial. The idea that customers could sign offline so that you might not have an internet connection when you're out in the middle of a field on the hood of a pickup truck, but we wanted that idea that that customer could still sign. And then also the idea that any vendor that we select would need to provide international support as we unroll electronic signature down the road. So key considerations there.
Another part of the electronic signature solution is what they call an e-vault. Where are you going to keep these things to comply with all of the requirements of UETA and e-sign and the UCC provisions? You have to have a secure server that meets a lot of specific requirements. Well, we already had a situation where we were shipping paper contracts out to an office in Reno, Nevada, and so that's where we actually have our own server out there that's it's pretty secure. It's covered by this metal grating and bolted to the floor and all that, and it has all the technology in it to process these electronic contracts after they're accepted. Now, that was quite a bit of work to set up the e-vault capability, and we'll go into some of the things that has to do. Most people probably hire an e-vault company to do that, but the important thing there is that e-vault has to maintain those contracts and have control and audit trails and all that to comply with all of those requirements of those statutes. And but there are a number of companies that offer the e-vault. The other thing that we had to consider was the paper out process. You at some point may have to convert an electronic original to a paper original. And that's required for us in various instances. We'll have situations where, say that where our credit extended to a customer is $500,000 and that's all we're comfortable extending, and they want to buy another excavator. We don't want to have to tell them to go to another lender. We may book that additional contract and then sell that off to another lender. Well, we either have to give that lender access to our eVault, and we never built it for third-party access, and you have to be careful who you let access it, or you've got to convert it to paper. Also, in some instances, when the dealer submits the contract to us, they make a number of promises to us. The contract is genuine, they witness the signature, everything that they have told us about the transaction is true. And there's some instances where one of those warranties is breached and we force the dealer to buy the contract back. Well, they don't have access to our eVault either, and so they want a paper original. There are a few, but not many, but a few instances where a judge just says, I want the paper original. And then there's a couple states in the consumer area that require a paper original contract be marked paid and sent back to the customer at payoff. So we needed a paper out process. And so we have in our electronic contracts a provision that says at our discretion we can convert the electronic original to paper. And then there's a certain process that one of two authorized people in Reno can do, and that involves the simultaneous production of an electronic original that has kind of an original watermark on it, and then the electronic authoritative copy on the server is then flagged as a copy. And as part of our solution here, if you print out an electronic contract, it always prints out with a copy watermark on it, because it's important that you only have one original. You can't have multiple originals of the same contract.
So we talked a bit about the vendor selection process and the idea that provided a diverse set of voices at John Deere to weigh in on which vendor that we selected. We ultimately opted with DocuSign, and we'd just like to share a little bit of background around DocuSign and some of the things that were particularly attractive to John Deere Financial in our choice with DocuSign. As you can see up here, you can see the slogan from DocuSign, that their vision is to empower anyone to sign anything, anywhere, anytime. Pretty comprehensive, and that's reflective of where DocuSign sits in the market. Very clearly the global leader in electronic signature. They have 20 million unique users of electronic signature, signing over 120 million documents to date using the DocuSign technology. So quite comprehensive there. Also international in scope. They have users in 188 countries, signing in 39 different languages. And as you recall, that was one of the key considerations that we had at John Deere Financial, to have that international support. When it came to the John Deere Financial solution, DocuSign was able to present a compelling presentation for us and our needs, and particularly around the offline solution. Now, this is something that is still in process. We're still working with DocuSign on the ability for that customer to sign on the back of her pickup truck in the middle of the field. We're still working on that capability with DocuSign, but it is something that we did build into our solution. Also compatible with John Deere dealers that had already purchased what we call a Topaz signature pad, so that as customers look to sign electronically, you might have seen this in your retail experiences, signing on a credit card transaction. It's just a little electronic screen with a stylus pen. Those dealers that had invested in that technology, consistent with what DocuSign can support. So lots of good things with DocuSign, and we continue to work closely with DocuSign as we build on our electronic signature with John Deere Financial. A bit more around DocuSign, and this particularly goes to the evidentiary standards that, of course, are very important for John Deere Financial and compliance with U.S. law. DocuSign provides a warranty that it will be compliant with eSign. And also, as we look toward the bottom of this screen, we see another slogan from DocuSign, in the sense that their technology, their electronic contract, is better than paper. And in many ways, you can see that, where the metadata, the who, the what, the when, the how, the tracking that DocuSign can have in place for that customer's signature is very important. So that if need be, we can go back and see the time that that customer signed, and it can indicate an intention to be bound by the terms of the contract, something that traditional paper would be hard pressed to do. So certainly evidentiary standards, the legal compliance, very important in our selection of DocuSign as well. So now we're starting to put the pieces together. We talked about the dealer needs, we talked about the customers, we talked about the technology. How do we start to assemble these things into the solution that we have in place today at John Deere Financial? And as many of you work with clients, know procedure, process, very important, no different at John Deere Financial, so that we already had processes in place for traditional paper contract acceptance. We needed to look to those and see if we needed to make any tweaks to that process now that we had electronically signed contracts coming into John Deere Financial. So we made sure that we updated our processes and procedures as needed. Also did extensive testing and worked closely with partners in the field, working with dealers to understand how this will be implemented within the John Deere dealership. We want to make sure that any solution that we put out there would be up and ready for dealers and customers to use. We also put support materials together, and certainly support for our internal employees so that we understood how this new electronic world might work, but also for our John Deere dealers, knowing that this was going to be a process change for our dealers. And we put together some flow charts to understand for people in the dealership, from the customer's signature all the way sending it into John Deere Financial, what were the steps needed, who should be doing what, when, and understanding how that could be put in place within the John Deere dealer. We put those flow charts together, and we also developed an online training module to understand from A to Z how that electronic signature could be collected and then submitted on a contract for John Deere Financial. And then finally, the idea of feedback, that constant communication loop, very important. And as you'll hear from me a little bit later on, I was part of that communication feedback loop when I was in the field, but understanding how it's working and understanding where we could improve, that was very important as well as we unveiled the electronic signature solution.
The next piece we had to work on once we got electronic signatures up and running was securitizing those assets. John Deere Financial funds its lending around the world really three ways. There's the equity that Deere puts in, and there's medium-term notes, and there's commercial paper, and then there's some asset-backed securitization. In an asset-backed securitization, you take a pool of notes, usually between $500 million and $1 billion worth, and you sell them into a trust, and investors buy into that trust. So the customer never knows that their account has been sold, but this trust, which the buyers are usually basically the world's largest banks, they buy a piece of each trust. And so we wanted to start putting electronic contracts into that. Well, the securitization process is kind of cumbersome, and it's also very lawyer intensive. And so we first had to start out in the outside law firm that we use for some securities work. They had to get comfortable with it. So we walked them through the process and the flow charts and the process and all that. Then when they were comfortable, then the main firm that represents the investor banks, they wanted to get comfortable with it. So we walked them through every step of the process and all the safeguards and how it complies with UETA and e-sign and the UCC. And then there's 4 rating agencies we use for these. Each securitization offer has a rating agency that rates it AAA, and we do credit enhancements and stuff to make sure it achieves that rating. But they all 4, so that's like Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch and one other agency I can't remember. So we had to walk through with their attorneys all of the process that we use. And then once all that was done, in 2009, we included the first batch of electronic contracts in a securitization pool. We were the first equipment finance company to do that. Nissan Motor Acceptance had done that for auto loans that were originated electronically before we did it. But that was a lot of work, but it was also reassuring in that if you can get that many lawyers to say that a process is compliant, you know you've done the right thing. And then the other thing we had to worry about is collecting these things. You know, we try to only loan money to people that are going to pay us back, but some of them don't. And we have a network of about 100 U.S. Collection law firms that collect past due accounts for us. And those they can be representing us in a bankruptcy proceeding. They can be used to get a replevin order when the customer won't turn the equipment over to us upon default. And then they also, if there's a deficiency still owing after the equipment's sold, and then that sale proceeds are applied, they'll pursue the customer and try to collect the money. And you want them to be able to first know the legal basis for electronic contracts and why they're at least as good as paper. You don't want them losing a case, particularly one that goes up on appeal, that creates a bad precedent for you. So you want them to have all the right tools that they need to prevail. And so we created a CD-ROM for all of them and sent it to them. And then we have meetings with them about every 2 years where either electronically or in person we get together with them. And we reviewed this at one of those meetings. And it reviews all the requirements, and these are in the outline materials, most of them are, on e-sign and UETA and the UCC. We included some case law reviews, and there's a really key case out there that's in the material, Lorraine versus Markle, American Insurance, where the judge took a lot of time and effort and really outlined the evidentiary issues very well. And then we also, in this CD-ROM, we gave them a template for a brief and an affidavit that it could use to, you know, establish in court how the process works. And this has worked very well. We have to update that from time to time, but you don't want those people who are collecting your contracts losing cases because you didn't give them the facts that they needed. So that whole process worked very well.
So continuing to put the pieces together, and we talked about the importance of a feedback loop, understanding what was working well with the John Deere dealer experience, what could be improved. And I was part of that myself in my career earlier on, working in the field. I was working with John Deere dealers in Arkansas and Louisiana as electronic signature was just coming aboard, and understanding how we could implement that successfully within their dealerships. Now, I was fortunate in that earlier, one of those dealers I mentioned at that John Deere, dealer meeting in 2008, one of those dealers was on my territory. So that worked out well, that dealer was already on board with the idea of implementing electronic signature. So we mentioned earlier about the importance of having corporate sponsors within the Deere company, John Deere Financial. We had those within the John Deere dealer as well. So it was very key to have those dealer principals making clear to all of their employees up and down the line that electronic signature is the way that we're going to conduct business, so that there was no mistaking the direction that dealer was taking with customer signature. Another idea that we put in place was to track adoption not only at the dealer level, but also at the employee level. Who is using electronic signatures successfully within a particular location, and maybe could we use some of those folks as super users or mentors for others who are maybe a little bit slower in adoption. And that constant tracking was effective, not only with electronic signature, but with a lot of change efforts to understand what's working, who's using it, and what can we do to enhance adoption. And then finally, we worked with John Deere dealers across the country to understand what could be improved. One of the things that we learned was that offline signature early on was very important, very well received, and that actually helped increase adoption. We're going to find out a little bit later that we had to, once we worked with DocuSign, temporarily take that off of the platter, and by taking that offline signature capability off the platter, that helped to decrease adoption of electronic signatures. So understanding that ebb and flow, understanding what was working in the field, very important.
We've talked about offline signing, and to explain how our process works today, the customer is at a dealer location. There's a dealer computer there. The keyboard and mouse are given to the customer, and they then complete the electronic signature process through DocuSign. And a dealer employee representative witnesses the transaction. And so that they verify identity before the person signs. So if they don't know them, they've checked the state-issued driver's license. And so that's how we make sure that we have the authorized signer. The offline signing is a similar scenario, except the dealer representative would, like you would take a paper contract to a customer and meet them out in the field or at the construction site. You would take your PC or tablet out to the customer, and they would then, with the dealer representative and the dealer representative as a witness, they would complete the transaction. And that's very important because dealers, particularly in the western parts of the United States, can be quite far apart. And if you tell somebody you've got to take 3 or 4 hours out of your day and drive to a dealership and sign, and you're buying a $500,000 piece of machinery, it's an easier sell if you say, I'll send a salesman out to your location and sign. And you can still do it today. If you go to the customer's home or place of business and they have a Wi-Fi connection, you can sign today. But a lot of times they want to do it basically outside where you don't have a Wi-Fi connection. We've been working with DocuSign on that. Frankly, it should have been available again by now, but in technology, sometimes things don't move as quickly as you would like. And so really that's the next step for us. Unfortunately, when we had to take that away, when we switched from just the Topaz signature pads to also being able to use DocuSign, as John Hughes mentioned, that did negatively impact the pace of dealer adoption of electronic signatures.
So in addition to offline signature being a next step, remote signature also being a next step for the John Deere Financial experience. And as we talked earlier about customers and the distance between customer and dealer, sometimes 4 hours of driving, and it's not always convenient for that customer to come into the John Deere dealership to sign a contract. Wouldn't it be neat if we could send that contract electronically to that customer so that he or she could sign in the kitchen at 8 o'clock at night and send it back to the dealer and then move on to John Deere Financial? The trick behind that, of course, is that no one would be able to see in the kitchen that customer signing to authenticate that he or she was the actual signer of that contract. So as we look at remote signature, really that authentication piece is crucial for us, and it's something that candidly we're still working through. The idea that an electronic process would prevent against not only fraud, someone acting as an imposter, but also repudiation, to say that the customer might have initially signed but then claims later on, oh no, I didn't sign. So preventing against fraud, repudiation, very important with an electronic process. As we look at John Deere Financial, a lot of the fraud that takes place with our paper contracts today, it's not some random person off the street trying to be an imposter for someone else. It's frankly within the family. It could be the son trying to sign on behalf of the father for a contract, and we're trying to prevent against that. And with an electronic process, John made this comment earlier, and it bears repeating, the idea that an electronic process need not be any better than a paper process in terms of preventing against fraud or repudiation. It just has to be as good as that paper process. So working through it, and one of the things that we need to tackle would be this idea of authentication. And we mentioned earlier that we've done some research around electronic signature, particularly around remote signing, and we've found some different options out there that could be effective in helping customers get the proper signature in place, but also John Deere Financial to confirm that that customer made that signature. We've got those options listed up here on the screen, and the research would tell us that any one of these by their lonesome, not a silver bullet in terms of preventing fraud or repudiation, but it's probably some combination of these options, because as we'll talk about, while some of these options have very clear benefits, they also have some drawbacks. So for example, we could offer up knowledge-based authentication questions, and we could ask the signer about properties that he or she might have owned. or vehicles he or she might have owned. And that would be a way that we could verify in terms of using public record information. The drawback behind that, particularly when we talk about farmer producers, they could own several different properties or several different vehicles in their lifetime, and they could be legitimately confused by a knowledge authentication question posed to them and saying, well, did I own that truck or not? So it could trip up people that we actually want to keep in. Passwords, we're all familiar with passwords using our online accounts in business or in personal life. Of course, unique and strong passwords can be effective. Unfortunately, they can also be forgotten. Tokens or smart cards, something physical that signer could have to use in authentication. Sometimes those can be lost or they could be misplaced. So that's a drawback there. We started to learn a little bit more about biometrics in our legal research around remote signature. And that's an emerging field, working with your eye scan or your thumbprint, something very unique to you as a signer. And yet there's a cost associated with that, and sometimes a fairly significant one for companies to implement. And then also too, some folks might not be really excited about providing a thumbprint just to be able to sign something electronically. So some drawbacks to consider there. And then finally, security questions. We could ask questions such as, what is your favorite book, or what is your favorite movie? Hopefully those things that only the signer would know. But as we talked about earlier with fraud, a lot of times family members or those close to the signer might be able to guess the correct answers to those security questions. So we'd have to judge which ones we ask and the number as well. So all of these things provide benefits. It's probably some combination of these in order to implement authentication within the solution.
I'll go a little bit off script here and talk about some of the issues we have. You know, the scenario we're trying to solve for is, as one dealer in Illinois described it, he's got a used combine on his lot, he puts it on his dealer website, and a guy in Kansas who he's never met wants to buy it and finance it with John Deere Financial. And they aren't going to send one of their people down there to deliver it. They're going to hire a trucking company that doesn't want to mess with paper documents and getting them signed. And so they want to be able to email this guy they've never met, know nothing about, and have an authenticated way to prove that he electronically signed that agreement. And so it's in some of these instances, like passwords and biometrics, if you meet with the person first, you can establish the baselines to allow you to use that verification. But if you have somebody you've never met, you know, you have to have an independent way to verify them. And then we do use passwords in a very limited way. We have about 20 of our largest customers that have signed an electronic signature agreement, and they say, if I'm dealing through this website and I use this password, no matter who uses it, I'm agreeing that that's a valid contract if you then complete the electronic signature concept or process. That's just not very scalable. It works well for a few large customers. It's not going to work well for 1 million customers. So we're kind of struggling with the, you know, how do you make these things work for our customer base? And then on the knowledge-based authentication, I'm sure a lot of you have used that. It's really built for suburban homeowners. It uses public record information, asks questions like, where have you lived, what vehicles have you owned? And for a normal suburban homeowner, that's pretty easy to answer. But then you got a farmer who maybe owns 6 farms, 3 of which have rental houses on them, and they've probably got half a dozen vehicles, and they tend to flunk those things. So we really need we're still looking for a good approach of kind of mass authentication that'll work for any U.S. customer.
Those are good additions. Thanks, John. So now we're coming to the finish line and talking about some best practices that we've shared this morning, and be happy to share again here as we close. The first idea of having that diverse set of voices on any type of vendor selection committee, that really helped to make sure that we met the business needs that John Deere Financial Deere & Company had for electronic signature. And then, as John mentioned earlier, the idea of having a comprehensive set of specifications. We want to make sure that we complied with not only commercial but consumer law, but we also wanted to make sure that we had an international solution. Also wanted to make sure that we had offline capability. Having that list at the outset really helped to steer our decision-making process. Talked about earlier the importance of having process and procedure. Again, probably not foreign to many of the clients that you serve, but particularly important within the finance industry and the John Deere Financial, given the regulation and compliance needs that we have, not only within John Deere Financial, but we also provided that process mapping for our end-use customers, the John Deere dealer, making sure that they understood how best to implement electronic signature. Talked about training. That was very important to have both online and also paper for an electronic solution, but paper as well, so that we could help folks understand how best to put that in motion. And then finally, we've talked about this several times, but it bears repeating here, the importance of having executive sponsors. With such a big change effort as taking something that traditionally is paper-based, putting in an electronic solution, having that buy-in at the very top and helping understand across the organization how important it is, that was particularly helpful in the John Deere Financial case.
We've also done a lot of benchmarking with other companies that have tried this, like Nissan and Harley Davidson and various other companies that are somewhat similar to ours, but not direct competitors. And I'm a firm believer, if you can borrow something that somebody else has done, as long as you don't violate, any intellectual property laws, and benefit from what they've created instead of trying to do it yourself, that's a great thing. And they're usually very helpful. Our competitors aren't very helpful to us, and we frankly don't ask them. But the companies that are like in the auto finance world, a similar business, somewhat different, we learned a lot from things they tried and have shared information with them. And also, whoever the players are in your business model, you've got to coordinate closely with them. We always knew that if we put out a solution that the dealers just wouldn't accept, that it would totally fail, because they have a choice. They don't have to do business with us. Also rolling it out in phases. There's some advantages and disadvantages to that. But we first rolled it out with the Topaz signature pads. The problem with that is every computer that uses, takes electronic signatures has to have a pad, and it costs about $300 a piece. And we also told the dealers, well, we're going to roll this out in phases. We're going to have offline signing in the future. We're going to have remote signing in the future. And you can't do it all at once, but if you tell your market that you're going to roll it out in phases and it's going to be an ever improving product, a lot of them will say, well, we'll just wait till that whole phase is done, so we don't have to make changes like replace our signature pads or anything like that. We'll just wait till you got it perfected and then we'll start. And so that has slowed adoption of electronic contracts. And then in this business, especially with technology, you got to be careful what you promise. I think everyone who deals with advanced technology at all knows that a lot of times the marketing people at the technology companies, and even in your own organization, the marketing people, no offense, because you spent a lot of time in marketing.
None offense taken. Yeah.
Sometimes they go, oh, no problem, we'll do that right away. And then when it comes down to the technical details, and also really testing things to make sure they're going to work and you're not going to put it out there and have it break down, that's very, very important. So you got to be careful what you promise. And when you say we'll probably have it next year, you really need to have it next year. And I believe in the concept that they call it double and double again. If you take the IT estimate, you double it and double it again, then you'll have about the right answer. So that's the conclusion of our presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
And I'll say, this is Jonathan Kennedy from the IP Section Council. We have a lot of attendees online, about 50 or 60 people on the webinar. So if you do have a question, I'll bring you the microphone just so that they can hear your question and benefit from that as well. I had one question, going back to your illustration of the story in person wants to buy something in Kansas and there's a dealer elsewhere. I mean, is there a possibility of utilizing, or have you guys historically utilized a dealer in that area to then help with the signature? Is that kind of been a stopgap for the time being?
Yeah, that is sometimes done, where they'll ask another dealer. They're always the neighboring dealers they're always competing against, but the ones that, like in Kansas, they could ask to do a favor. And if the other dealer is willing to do it, that would be a solution. And there's also, for a fee, you can go into most banks and they have, you know, signature verification processes, and they issue kind of a limited guarantee. And so that's another solution that is used in the paper world, or could be used with an electronic transaction too. We just need to have something that's very fast and easy. If we're not the quickest and easiest finance vendor, you know, they'll just go somewhere else. So we need something real quick for remote signature.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, then I want to thank you both for speaking with us and for your presentation. It was excellent and really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.